Hello, Mike.
Morning, how are you? Have you had a busy day?
No, especially, actually, it's been okay. I had a skip delivery this morning. That was exciting.
Yes.
And then I wrote 2,000 words, and then I practiced the accordion, and then I
As
went on
one
my
does.
bike. Yeah, and I've been out on my bike, and now I'm back, and I've done a bit more work, and it's all right.
So, Richard, how's this strange time affecting you?
Well, it's kind of hard to tell because it was already strange for me because I became a widow at Christmas. So I'm just getting used to that new reality. And then all of a sudden we're all plunged into an unexpected and unforeseen reality. So that's kind of two registers of weird going on at the same time. So I don't know, too close to it at the moment to make a judgment, I think. I'm really struck by the things I've liked about lockdown, and that might seem a little facetious because we're here for reasons which are grim and awful. But actually, I have found all sorts of things, unexpected things that I've really enjoyed. And that's been interesting. Doing nothing has been really good. I haven't done nothing, but not running around the whole time, which is very sort of counter to my natural state, I've actually really liked it, Mike.
Quite a few people who I've spoken with who write say that they thought this was going to be a wonderful opportunity and have actually found they couldn't write anything.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I've had to write because I've got a gun to my head in the form of a deadline and a repayable advance if I don't deliver. Nothing like that to concentrate the mind, of course. But I found it really hard. I've not been able to read, but I haven't been able to read since David died. And I think also perhaps there's just lots of stuff happening to all of us in this weird moment, which is taking up a lot of the sort of energy that is necessary for creative endeavour. Although publisher told me that he's never had so many submissions of manuscripts as he had since lockdown began. So maybe some people are finding it easy to write, but it should never really be easy to write, I don't think.
It should not. Can you tell me about the little Richard Coles?
The little Richard Coles?
Yeah, about you when you were a kid.
I'm the middle of three boys, and I think I don't know very much about child development, but I understand that the middle of three, particularly of the same gender, is often an interesting one. I remember I used to work in a church where me and the vicar and another clergy attached, we were all the middle of three children of the same gender, and we were all gay vicars, so go figure. And I grew up in Northamptonshire, where I live now. My father was a shoe manufacturer, a family firm that had been going for 4 generations. Very typical of that sort of world, which you would know well, Mike, because I guess it's not very far from you, and your clientele, I suspect, might have had deep roots in that sort of background. So we grew up on the edge of Kettering in a place called Barton Seagrave, and there was this sort of millionaires' row of Barton Seagrave where Kettering's beau monde lived. Walkton Lane, Poplars Farm Road, Ridgeway Road. So I grew up there. In that same road lived my grandparents, my uncle and my aunt and my great-grandparents. So it was very sort of Walton's Mountain in that sense. And we enjoyed the privileges that the wealth created by shoemaking in Northamptonshire had brought. And we also, I think, had to sort of live with the consequences of being shoe manufacturers in Northamptonshire. It was not a world which I couldn't say that it was lively in culture, Mike. And quite early on, I sensed that there was a big world out there with exciting and captivating and rich and mysterious things going on, not many of which were trickling down to Kettering. There were sort of people around who I think connected to that world too. And I went to Wellingborough School, which is a local independent school, and there were masters there who were connected to that world. And so I sort of plugged myself in tentatively to a grid of music and painting and sculpture and poetry and literature. But I was very much the country cousin. I can remember we had some glamorous cousins who, well, they weren't cousins actually, but they were friends, but they were like cousins. We grew up together. And I remember going to the 18th birthday party of one of them who was at Eton. And the 18th birthday party was on HMS Belfast. And I remember standing there feeling just so kind of frumpy and out of place, and yearning to be someone who went to parties on HMS Belfast with Etonians. But that was yet to come.
Where did the music come from?
Well, I think it really came from my grandfather, who was a pianist, and he used to entertain. He was a very entertaining person if you didn't stand too close to him, I think. And he used to hold people. He used to sing at the piano. He was very famous. He used to wear a monocle and +4s, and he drove a Rolls Royce, and he was very sort of glamorous. And he had a grand piano, and he would sit at the piano and play mostly, I think, smutty songs, which I didn't understand. But I loved the way that he held everyone's attention, and I thought, oh, I want to be like that. And then on my mother's side of the family, she had an aunt who was a professional violin player, and she was a remarkable person. She used to smoke a pipe and wear jodhpurs, which again, I don't think I really interpreted at the time, although now, of course, I do. And she lived with a woman called Elspeth in Notting Hill, and Elspeth was rather fey, and Tootie, as we called her, was rather butch. But Tootie smoked like a chimney, would happily give me cigarettes when I was a teenager, and whiskey. And we would listen to music and talk about all sorts of things. She retired and came up to Northamptonshire and retired to a village here, and then got in a terrible fight with a policeman who did her for speeding, and promptly died.
Did you are the most eloquent man I've ever met.
Well, thank you, I think.
And that was meant to be, it is a compliment.
Thanks.
And I really mean that. And also, you have had the most extraordinary, I was going to say career, but it's not just a career. It's...
Oh, it's odd, isn't it? I had to do my CV for someone a little while ago, and I handed it in. And the person who read it said, if I didn't know this was for real, I would assume it was the work of a fantasist, because it does seem unusually vivid and full of unexpected twists and turns. I mean, it didn't seem like that to me. Of course, your life is just your life, isn't it? One damn thing after another. And it never, on the contrary, I'm if anything were to keep me awake at nights, it would be the feeling that I'd not done anything. And my life was a sort of story of unfulfillment and opportunities missed. But I'm not sure I'd really, I used to feel like that. I don't think I feel like that now.
Did you have within you a feeling from when you were quite little that actually you could achieve some extraordinary things?
I think I probably did, but in a rather sort of idiotic and vainglorious sort of way. I think I felt pregnant with eminence, if you see what I mean. And when I was young, I was very ambitious and I wanted to be a great composer. And I remember writing to Benjamin Britten, saying I wished to be a great composer and inviting him to, I don't know, mentor me in this enterprise. And I got a sort of brush-off letter back from a secretary, a very nice one, but nonetheless not from the great man himself. And then years later, not that long ago, I discovered another friend of mine had written to Benjamin Britten saying he wanted to be a great composer, and got a lovely letter back from the great man himself. So obviously, I don't know what I put in mind that didn't win that favour, but it didn't win that favour.
What sort of age were you when you wrote? Do you remember?
8.
So you did have that feeling from quite early on that maybe you were special.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I wanted to be special, but I think I probably didn't think I was particularly special. And after a while, you realise that that doesn't really mean anything. But I was sort of, I think I was sort of slightly, I kind of yearned for. Again, I think it's something about I remember talking to a friend of mine, Edmund White, the writer, who grew up in Ohio, Cleveland. And he said that he thought that his whole life when he was young was dominated by the desire to not be someone who came from Cleveland. And I think coming from Kettering, although I have much more grateful feelings about Kettering now, I think I just wanted to be someone who didn't come from Kettering. So I would kind of just was fascinated by people who lived. I had a very good friend called Colin who lived around the corner from me. And we both vowed that we would go to live in Paris. And actually we both did. And funny enough, when I was there, when I was in my 20s, I bumped into Colin, and we met up and we went for dinner. And he is now the head barman at the Hemingway bar and the absolute doyen of barmen and Mr. Cocktail, Monsieur Cocktail. So he stayed in Paris and has done extraordinarily well. I came back from Paris, and funny enough, I'm back in Kettering, near enough.
Well, I wasn't going to point that out. And why did you, when you left Wellingborough, you didn't go to uni?
No. Which
would have been the thing that one would have expected from you.
Well, not really. And the reason was that I left at 16. I'd sort of come to the end of the patience of my schoolmasters, I think. And also I was off the rails at 16, Mike, and I wasn't going to stay. So I sabotaged my O-levels. And then I think my parents must have thought, why the hell are we paying for him to go to this school when he's just, sabotaging it? So my mother rather brilliantly found an FE college, further education college in Stratford-on-Avon, which was run by a very enterprising drama teacher called Gordon Valens, who invented the theatre studies A-level, among other things. And Gordon ran this college, which had a drama department, which was bespoke, vocational drama course with the theatre studies A-level built in, for essentially delinquent middle-class teenagers, of which I was one. And so I went there and did my A-levels studying drama in this wonderful, wonderful place with some lovely people who are still friends of mine. And it was just extraordinarily creative and funded by a thing called a local education authority, which paid my fees and gave me a grant at 16. And at the end of that, when I was 18, I did my A-levels. And that would have been perhaps when I'd gone to university. And I thought about going to Cambridge there was my cousin had been there, and I sort of fancied myself, I think partly as a sort of brilliant Don, without actually having figured that would involve doing some work and being competent and able. So, but that sort of came when what I really wanted to do was go to London. So at 18, I sort of went to London, and my life took a very different turn.
Will you say you went off the rails. How off the rails did you go?
Very off the rails for a while, to the point where I was hospitalised. When I was 17. I spent, I think, summer in St Andrews, Northampton. And again, I was just so lucky to find a psychiatric hospital that was humane and liberal and believed very much in the power of the arts. And I had a wonderful time there. It was another sort of finishing school in a way. And I met some people there who remained friends, actually. And again, they were people who connected to this kind of bigger ritual. And that was what got me to London, because one of the people I met there, she was from St John's Wood in London, and her father was a piano manufacturer. And I made friends with her. And then when I moved to London, I moved into flat share with her. She had a flat in West Hampstead. And so that was my first foothold in London, where dreams come true and lives could be lived. And also because it was gay, I mean, gay in Kettering in 1978, 1980 was not something that suggested a life rich in fulfillment lay ahead. So obviously London was the place to go to find that, and it was.
How old were you when you realised that you were gay?
I mean, realised, I suppose when puberty came along and sexual desire came along, then I never had it never went any other way. So it was never a thing that I was confused about at all. It was unwelcome because I didn't want to be ostracized. And in those days, you could have been, and I didn't want that. And so I kept that secret because I thought it was necessary for my own survival, until I thought, actually, no, this is not necessary and it's inimical to my survival. So at 16, I came out, and that was a life-saving thing to do, really. But I think in retrospect, Mike, sorry, I'm not answering the question. I think from the age of about 8 or 9, it would have been obvious to anyone. I remember a friend of mine, it was a few years ago, and she said to me, I think my son might be gay. And I said, how old is he? And she said, well, he's 8. And I said, kind of young. And she said, well, would you talk to him, see what you think? I went, okay. So we went away for a weekend, and I went for a walk, and I talked to him, and I said, oh, hello, Freddie, what do you like? And he said, well, I think more than anything, I like Victorian neo-Gothic church architecture, and I thought, you're gay. And so it came to pass. He is very happily married to another bloke now.
Lovely. Incidentally, just as a sort of aside, you and I both share the experience at St Andrews.
Oh, you've been as well?
I have, yes.
Well, you'll know what I mean, Mike. I mean, it was a brilliant place to go. I think, as I know, James Rhodes, the pianist, he's also an alumnus of St Andrews. Yeah. And it's a place, I know, it always has been a place of genuine liberal commitment. And I got a lot out of it. Did you enjoy it, if that's the word?
Did I enjoy it? I refused to go as an inpatient.
Okay.
So I went once a week. And I'm not really sure whether I enjoyed it or not, but it probably saved me from doing something stupid at the time.
Yeah, I think it did me as well. I still see my psychiatrist. There was a wonderful chap called Colin Wilson, who is, I don't know if you know Colin, he's a great art collector actually, and he's retired now, but he lives near Northampton. And he gave me Geoffrey Week's book, Coming Out, which was the sort of first serious academic book looking at the sociology of what it is to be gay and stuff. And that was, I mean, that was a timely gift. It worked for me.
So you go to London.
Yes.
The big city and all the lights.
Yeah. Well, it was grimy. I made landfall, first of all in West Hampstead, but before, as soon as I could, I moved to King's Cross, and I sort of connected to the gay world once I got to London, and I became part of a gay theatre group called Consenting Adults in Public. And let's see what we did there. And then I've got a flat share with some other people who were in it in King's Cross, and when King's Cross was not the glossy zone of enterprise it is today. Well, it was a zone of enterprise, but it wasn't very glossy. Just where Pentonville Road and Caledonian Road meet, so right on the grimiest, seediest corner of London, and found myself all of a sudden with a group of friends who all were like me. There was gay runaways who would come to London to try to make a new life, and we were all living in cheap flats or squats or, believe it or not, hard to let council property around King's Cross and Islington, unimaginable now. And we were in the same place at the same time. We thought roughly the same thing. Previous generation of activists had kind of opened up gay spaces, but we'd been through punk. And I think punk gave us something different. And sociologists now call it the alternative gay scene, and I was part of that, although I don't think we realised that's what we were doing. But that's what it later came to be called.
I mean, it was still a difficult time to be gay, wasn't it? I mean, had you have been a schoolmaster in a public school, even then you would have been probably asked to leave.
Yeah, I mean, it was shame and disgrace and illegality. So I mean, it wasn't because at that time, sex between adult males was illegal. It was decriminalised under certain circumstances, but you had to be over 21. So it was still a sort of penal age. Interesting word. And it meant that you were outlaws, renegades. But of course, if you're 20, I quite like being an outlaw and a renegade. Especially for me, an outlaw and a renegade would really mine was much more a sort of, I kind of like classical music and the harp. So it gave me a sort of radicalism that I don't think I otherwise would have had.
And have you continued to like being something of a renegade?
That's a good question. I suppose I've always found myself to some degree at odds with the world I'm in, and I must seek that, I suppose. I wouldn't do it otherwise. It's more nuanced than that now, and I'm not sure I like it so much because I quite like, it's different now. 58 is very different from 18, and I'm more interested in how things, I suppose I'm more interested in continuities than discontinuities now, and how radical impulses relate to the status quo. I think that's much more interesting, really.
And then you met Jimmy.
Yeah, I met Jimmy when he was 19, I was 18. He'd escaped from Glasgow, where he'd grown up in a very rough working class sectarian background and had to flee to London. and he was like, oh, it's just a sort of extraordinary, like a jolt of electricity. I'd never met anyone like him before. Didn't understand a word he said for about 6 months, and that was interesting. Did
that matter?
No, not really, because I think he was the first person I'd really thrown my lot in who was not like me, who didn't wake up in the morning with the assumption that the rising arc of my life would continue to bring me, interest and reward. Jimmy woke up in the morning thinking, how do I get through the day? How do I survive? His assumptions, his experience of life was different. And I just found that incredibly thrilling and stimulating and frightening, and took me to places I didn't know existed and didn't want to go sometimes. And I learned a lot.
May I ask whether you were close?
I can't remember, Mike. I honestly can't remember. Someone said, did you read Jimmy? We don't think we had a fling. I can't remember if we... sort of a shag was like a handshake in the gay world of the 1980s, the early 80s. So I can't remember.
But you joined up with him and...
Yeah, a group of us. And we started this little we were a scene really. And then we made a documentary. There was a guy called Andy Littman, who was a lawyer, worked in a legal aid practice. And Andy was an activist too. And he was interested in filmmaking. And when Channel 4 started, he got a whole load of kit and some budget from a brilliant man called Alan Fountain, who was a commissioning editor at Channel 4, who died just a couple of years ago. And Alan was just really curious at looking at all these subcultures that were kind of bubbling up in London, which was a very fertile place for subcultures in the 1980s. And Channel 4 had a new remit and they were doing things differently. And so he gave a whole load of people kit and money and said, turn the cameras on yourselves and tell your story. So we did. Jimmy and me and a group of people, we formed the Gay Youth Video Collective, and we made a video about ourselves called Framed Youth, which was very rough and ready, but it won the Grierson Award from the BFI for the best documentary of the year. Quite a controversial choice, as I recall. But it just revealed a kind of subculture that people weren't really aware of. And in the course of doing that, we needed some music. I was already working as a musician, playing the saxophone, doing theatre music and stuff. And then we needed a song, and Jimmy said that he'd sing something, and all of us expected his singing voice would be as gruff as his speaking voice. But what came out, of course, was this extraordinary sound, this high falsetto, powerful and vulnerable at the same time. It was so thrilling to hear. And so that was how Jimmy and I started making music together. And not long after that, Bronski Beat happened. And they made a record, and it went straight to the top of the charts, and boom, all of a sudden, Jimmy was a star. And then I kind of jumped into his slipstream, played saxophone for Bronski Beat. And then he said, well, let's leave Bronski Beat and start a new thing. So we did, and that was how the Communards started. And then I became a pop star, which was even less likely than Jimmy.
How difficult was that for you?
Becoming a pop star?
Yeah.
Harder for him than for me, because, I was a hopeless pop star, Mike. It was really not built for that at all, but it was an era of awkward, geeky men in pop music. So it was a good time to be a kind of geek. The contrast between me and Jimmy was, I think, quite marketable. I was the sort of middle-class public school boy who could play stuff, and Jimmy was the working-class Glaswegian who could sing stuff. And that worked. And also, I wasn't thrown by, in those days, pop music was an enormously lucrative and well-rewarded thing to do. So with success came, money and all the things that money buys. And that was a new experience for Jimmy, but for me, wasn't. So I was more at home in hotels and restaurants than he was.
Who wrote the stuff?
I did the music and Jimmy did the words of our own songs, but we weren't very good at it. And our two biggest hits were both cover versions, which tells you something about our abilities as songwriters.
But it went very big. It went worldwide, didn't it?
Yeah, it was. We made a record in 1986 called Don't Leave Me This Way. and it was the biggest selling single of the year, and it just sort of went everywhere then. And then we were already sort of doing okay, but when that came along, it sort of took us to another level. And then it was all sort of private planes and suites and never stopping and craziness.
And was it difficult did you feel yourself in the sort of slipstream of, because he being a pretty boy with an extraordinary voice?
I didn't, it wasn't slipstream, I was in his shadow. So
Right.
Jimmy is a super gifted, extraordinarily talented person with the sort of, I remember Simon Napier Bell, who's a very brilliant manager and observer of pop stars, said, the star is someone who turns the raw material of their life into their art. And that's Jimmy. He just had this, it's a degree of self-possession, which I don't have. And that's what made him so extraordinary. But it also meant that he got all the attention and all the credit. And I just was the geeky one standing in the background. Yeah, I shouldn't have minded, because actually in the long term, I think it probably worked out better for me than for him, in that I'm allowed to be something else, Whereas I think for Jimmy, who has such a distinctive, he will always be that. Well, not a bad thing to be at all, but I think that sort of success can slightly straitjacket you. I don't know.
Sure. Well, he surely is the guy who was.
Well, he still very much is, but I think if you've had that massive success, most people will keep you there in their minds and their memories if they were around. Whereas for me, I've allowed to do other things. So in that sense, that's probably been quite good for me. I don't know.
Well, when you say allowed to do, I mean, you actually created that, didn't you? It didn't.
Well, that implies I had some sort of brilliant, thoughtful agency in all this. But what it feels like, Mike, is I just kind of went from one thing to another. And I sort of lurched sideways into this and then lurched sideways into that. It wasn't until ordination came into focus that I really think I started getting into gear.
What was that about?
Oh,
ordination.
Well, there's a line from a poem by C.H. Sisson. He says, "The vain, the ambitious, and the highly sexed are the natural prey of the incarnate Christ." And tick. And I mean, in retrospect, of course, I mean, I was absolutely certain that I would for all my life be, without any hesitation or anything, an atheist, of which I was the first conviction I ever had was that we were alone in the universe and that God was a myth. Until I found myself standing on the edge of it and went forwards instead of back. And then all that changed in an instant. And the minute it did, I kind of realized that everything had been a kind of prelude to that, really. And that was the sort of rest of my life.
I can sort of understand that moment when you have some sort of mystical experience and you feel that there is something other.
Mm.
It's a big leap, isn't it, to take on a particular book and all that involves.
Well, it's not, I mean, I wasn't in the market for a book, if you see what I mean. What happened was I found myself starving hungry and there was food in front of me and I reached for it and I started eating. That's what happened. And then everything else followed from that. So I had this experience of, oh, here is food, here is sustenance, I am hungry, and this connects to my hunger. And so I sat down and I ate, and then found myself that I was a guest at a dinner table alongside other people, and I needed to just work out what that meant. And so everything else sort of followed from that. So it was that experience of the reality of Jesus Christ was the thing that changed everything. And once I'd been gripped by that and recognized it, then I kind of worked my way into the other stuff. But it began with this, it was like a Pauline conversion moment, if I could flatteringly compare myself with the greatest theologian of the church. But
I'm sure you can. Why? And what was it? Was it a sudden moment that?
Yeah, it was. I mean, two things happened. One is the sudden moment, and that was first time I went to church. I was sitting at the back of the church, and there was solemn high mass going on. at St Albans, Holborn, which was a very, very high church indeed, with a full, full fig, smells and bells and everything. And all of a sudden, the priest held aloft the wafer, and words of consecration were said, and a bell went, and smoke rose, and the choir sang. And I just felt something inside me break. It was like a dam, or chains. It's classic conversion, actually, and that sort of just broke. And all of a sudden, I knew that I was not a stranger in this unfamiliar territory, but it was my homeland. And the kind of gobbledygook that I was hearing suddenly was my mother tongue, and that was it. But of course, in retrospect, I could see that it had been coming for a very, very long time.
Well, I was going to say, you're such a bright man. You must have surely looked back into your past to maybe see where the beginnings of that was coming from, because it's a massive thing, a massive change.
Yeah. Because I was a chorister when I was a kid, Mike. So I grew up in the fold, although I was always not part of it. You see what I mean? I was, a renegade, if you like,
right,
at odds with the world I found myself in. But I identified very strongly with it. I loved the music. And also, if you're in an Anglican choir, a decent choir in a cathedral or a public school, whatever, you're making music at a professional level before you're out of short trousers, literally.
right.
So that forms you for life. And also, I liked being in chapel. I thought it was all a nonsense and a fairy tale, and the doctrine was facetiously ridiculous and not to be taken seriously. But I liked the people who did it. I think that's very common now. It's an interesting thing about when you're ordained, you realise that I think a lot of people are drawn to people who make the commitment. They might find sermons unintelligible, the Bible unreadable, the tradition impenetrable, but they relate to people. And someone who does it, who makes this commitment, people are sometimes fascinated by that. And sometimes hostile, actually, but it still has a sort of, I don't know, it's a bit like a sort of lightning conductor, I think. You sort of conduct energies that still are something that, I don't know, makes people alert or interested or something.
So you give everything up to go and do a theological degree, but you're a Catholic at that time.
Yeah, well, so my sort of my discovery of Christianity was in its Catholic form. And then there was a sort of 9-year period as a Roman Catholic, which it took, and in that time I worked out that I was in fact Church of England. It took a while to do that. And then once I'd realised that, then ordination came sharply into focus. I'd rather put it off before then. And then I thought, well, I've got to do something about this. In fact, it was a friend of mine. She said, you've got to do something about this. And I made a call and went to see someone, and she thought that I might have a vocation to ordain ministry. And then you go through this selection process, which takes quite a long time. And then at the end of it, they said, yeah, we think you do too. So I went off to theological college to West Yorkshire, to the monastery of the Resurrection, Community of the Resurrection in Mirfield. I spent 2 years living in a monastery and training, and that was the kind of best and worst time of my life in a way. I learned, people often think Christianity, particularly Anglican Christianity, is a sort of sitcom, really, of bumbly vicars and PCCs and church faiths, and it is all those things. But at its heart, it's extremely powerful and speaks to the entire range of human experience, its depths, its heights, the worst of us, the best of us. It's not for kids. And I think we forget that sometimes. So kind of finding your way in that is powerful.
And you could afford to take the time off?
Well, I mean, I just did. So like most, I mean, also I could be in the sense that I wasn't attached to anyone then. So I was a lone ranger, and I could make, I could walk away from things. I could change my life. I could go from earning relatively lots of money to earning nothing. And that was fine. It's never been a problem for me, actually. It was only after I was ordained that I met David and my life changed again.
Was being, when you're on that path, was being openly gay, which you've always been, Was that difficult? I mean, I appreciate that you will have met lots of gay vicars or gay people training for the priesthood.
Yeah.
Mostly that they were probably fairly quiet about it, weren't they?
Well, yeah, I mean, I didn't have a choice other than be open because I'd already been open. If
yes,
you see what I mean.
That's what I mean. And I'm just wondering whether that was awkward for you.
No, not so. I mean, I got very frustrated sometimes, and still do, with the debates that are live in the church, which I sometimes think I started having this argument, and I won this argument to my own satisfaction when I was 16, and we're still having it in some ways. So, but there's no way around that. It's a very live and difficult and intractable problem for us in the church at the moment. So we just have to deal with it as best we can. But I never felt for a second that my own well-being was threatened at all. So I've never felt for a second that God minded me being gay in the least. I've never felt that. And if the church has a problem with it, that's the church's problem in my view and experience. So I just have to deal with it.
And does the church still have a problem with it?
Some of it does. I mean, it's quite a lot of it does. It depends where you go and who you ask. But, that's where we are. And I would prefer it to be, I would wish it were different, but it's not. So fight the good fight, hold your head up, do what you can, remain faithful. There's a thing in the, when we're ordained, there's a bit the bishop says in which the bishop sort of sets out what we're doing, think we're doing, should be doing. And there's much in that which talks about being faithful to the tradition we stand in, but at the same time being alert for the signs of God's new creation. Because if we think we've kind of got it and that our job is simply to maintain and sustain a tradition like the National Trust of Spirituality or something, well, we're mistaken, because new stuff happens all the time, because it's not a fossil. It's something that is very much alive and surprising.
And you meet David.
Yeah.
You become soulmates.
Yeah.
And you wed, and yet you have to live in a celibate relationship. Do you think that's right?
No, I don't. We're civil partnered. At the moment, marriage, if you're clergy, is an option which would cost you your licence. So at the moment, that's not something we can do and continue to hold a bishop's licence. So we were civilly partnered, although it's just a sort of meaningless distinction as far as we were concerned. But we were obliged to live under a discipline, which in the end kind of worked okay for us. But I resent the fact that we have to, and I don't know. It was a bearable burden for us. I don't think it is for other people, and that is a cause of pain, I think, and regret.
And do you think it'll be long before that changes? Because it seems to me, as an outsider, very easy to say, but a complete nonsense.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it does to lots of people too. But I mean, I don't want to suggest that opposition to it is without content or serious and thoughtful consideration. The church has for hundreds and hundreds of years held to a very particular line about what moral and holy relationships look like. And it relied on an understanding of sexuality, which is not something which squares with an understanding of sexuality that's informed by what we know now. But it's a long-standing and deeply held and profoundly important position for people, and they don't give that up easily or readily, if at all. So, that's where I don't think people, I'm just sort of screaming homophobe at people. I mean, there are homophobic people, but I think, not necessarily. I think people are genuinely unable to give up what the church has taught for, as I say, hundreds and hundreds of years in all sorts of places and times and circumstances, that holy relationships are restricted to one man, one woman. And, that doesn't just go away. And
despite the fact that we are relatively liberal over here, in other parts of the world, it's horrendous, isn't it? I watched a programme. In fact, I couldn't bear to see it. It was a programme the other night on Chechnya.
Yeah, I mean, horrendous. If you look
I could not. I watched about a quarter of an hour, and I had to stop. I just could not watch it.
I mean, you don't have to go that far away. You can go into the Russian Federation and you will find extraordinarily homophobic. Eastern Europe, especially with the rise of the populist right, because one of the tropes of that is this intense visceral hatred of LGBT people. Equatorial Africa, I spent some time working in Uganda, and that's another thing. The Caribbean, some of the kind of West Indian culture, some of that is extremely hostile and homophobic. And of course, there are conservative Islamic cultures, which again are massively, massively illiberal and hostile. So we have, I'm fortunate to be doing what I do when and where I am, but you don't have to go very far away to find a different story.
And has that made, have you had any of that with your congregations or not?
No, not that I'm aware of. In fact, if you turn up and people have certain assumptions about you, what then happens is you get to know them, and assumptions on all sides tend not to survive for long. Once you get to know people, it's different. So, people have always been incredibly welcoming and supportive, and if they've had any reservations or problems, or there's a kind of another aspect to it, which is not about me as a person, but about LGBT people generally, it's never been a problem of any particular dimension. It's been fine.
And you have a whole other career, and that's the broadcasting. And I'm trying to remember when that started.
Well, it began, my first ever, after pop music, once I stopped doing pop music, because I had a sort of currency in media, it was quite a natural, I became a film critic for a TV, there's a thing called Night Network, which was the first nighttime broadcast program. It was London Weekend Television. It was a Friday and Saturday night. It was all through the night, and I was the film critic on that. And that got me a job. Emma Freud was another presenter on that. So I went to then be agony aunt on Emma Freud's show on GLR, which is the BBC local station in London. And then from that, I went to Radio 5 when that began. Again, very lucky to get involved with something when it's just beginning, because nobody knows what they're doing. So people like me get jobs. And the minute I sat in a live radio studio, I just thought, yeah, I get this. I know what to do. It was, I just find it a very congenial place to be. And I just stayed. After Radio 5, I went to Radio 3 and did some 9 years in Radio 3, which I loved. Nobody listened to it, but it didn't matter in those days. Then I had some time out, 3 or 4 years out to train. And then when I came back to London, I started broadcasting again, Saturday Live, filling in for Fee Glover when she was off on maternity leave. And thought that was a sort of closed chapter in my life, but actually really enjoyed being back in the studio. And then I've just stayed there ever since. No one sacked me yet. Can't be long, but
I absolutely, I very rarely get the chance to listen to the whole of that programme, but I do listen to as much as I can driving to work, and love it when I hear you begin to go off what I think is the script.
Oh yeah,
the script.
Yeah.
I always thought that actually when you were on your own, it was even more dodgy than when you were with somebody.
That's probably true. Yeah, I do. I've been doing it for a long time. I've been doing live radio now for 30 years, and I never, it's not, there are no rules. There's nothing written down. There are a couple of things written down that you shouldn't do. Don't crash the pips, you know what I mean? Don't libel people. But essentially, it is live. And after a while, you, with a bit of experience, you sometimes think, I might pursue that, because you're reading someone all the time, which is one of the interesting things about lockdown, is interviewing people you can't see. So sometimes you think, we'll go there, won't go there. Sometimes you think, there might be a rapport there. And sometimes you go down a rabbit hole to the immense frustration of producers. But that's what presenters do, you see. And I like it.
You know everybody, don't you?
No.
Don't you?
But I probably know nearly everybody. No, I don't. Yeah, if you're doing a program like Saturday Live, excuse me, after a while, anyone who's got a book out or a telly out, something like that, you know, they come through, and then after a while they come through again. Now, sometimes I can't remember that I've met them before. And a couple of times I've said, "Oh, it's so nice to meet you," and someone said, "Well, actually, I was on your show like 2 weeks ago." Oh, well. Because you have to sort of cram for every program. So we have our 4 guests, and then you really concentrate on them for that week, and then they've gone, and you start concentrating on next week's. You know.
Does someone help you with the research, or do you have to do it all?
Oh no, a team of producers and researchers do all the heavy lifting, and they produce a brief, and they send a brief. If there's a book or a film, I look at the book, I see the film, and then we have a meeting on Fridays, and then I write the script, and then do the program on a Saturday.
Do you mind if it's a plug? Does that bother you?
Well, there's plugs and there's plugs. I mean, we try very hard to plug as softly as possible, but there are certain people you will only get if because they've got something to sell. So we try to find a way of not just tell me about your book, but just tell me about this, tell me about that, and then in your book, blah, 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 and then just at the end, the book's out now kind of thing. But what's much more interesting is when they start interacting with the people around the table or down the line. And that's when the interesting stuff happens.
And does it ever get embarrassing?
Yeah, I mean, you do have to risk stuff, and sometimes it goes wrong, and sometimes you misread something. But again, it's live radio, and it's different for me now. I think partly because I've been doing it for so long, and partly I think because I'm a vicar. I don't know. I think people are perhaps more kind of kindly disposed to me than when I started out. I don't know. I used to have people walk out of interviews sometimes, and that hasn't happened for a long time.
Well, why is that?
Well, I think partly because I'm not interested in catching people out, you know?
Right.
When I was doing interviews before I was ordained, then sometimes you would have quite difficult interviews sometimes because you were trying to get them to talk about something they didn't want to talk about. On Saturday Live, which is sort of confessional in tone, people very often do want to talk about things. Sometimes they don't, and sometimes you'll get them to talk and say more than they wanted, and sometimes they really won't like it at all. But I don't want to. I remember interviewing, I think it was Alistair Campbell, and afterwards someone was angry with me saying, "Why didn't you go on about the Iraq War?" And I thought, well, you know, this is not the Today programme, and there are other people who are better able to do that, and other programmes are better able to do that. I'm much more interested in how do you feel about people's reaction to you if they shout war criminal at you in the street. That's what I want to know. And also, you know, I'm a priest, and the way I relate to people is sympathetic and engaged, I hope. And you know, that's a transferable skill perhaps between pastoral work and interviewing people, although it's a different context. And, you know, I have 7 minutes to get what we want out of somebody on Saturday Live. And of course it could be 7 years with somebody pastorally.
And do you get nervous before you do it?
I think I do, because it's live radio and there are more than 2 million people listening, and anything can happen. But I'm so used to it that it doesn't get in my way. I use it as fuel now, I think. I think that's true with lots of performers, is that if you don't feel, if your pulse doesn't rise, and if your adrenaline doesn't squirt before you go on stage or go live, you probably shouldn't be doing it, actually. But it's not something that disables you, it's something that enables you, and you use it as fuel.
From where I sit, it looks to me as though the BBC has changed remarkably in the last few years.
The BBC is changing remarkably every day. Yeah, it's. I mean, it feels very. It's hard to be optimistic about the future of the corporation at the moment, and it's a source of deep sadness and regret and some anger, I think, for lots of people. Although lots of people would be only too happy to see it go, but once it's gone, I think they'll probably regret that they didn't try harder to keep it.
But for many of us, we have relied on it for our entertainment, for our news. We have been able to believe it. We've trusted it. And that seems to be slipping away.
Yeah, and I mean, some people, it's very interesting. When I'm doing Saturday Live, we have a screen which gives me all the live comments on Twitter and texts and emails of stuff that's coming in. So it's real-time reactions. And we come at the end of the Today programme. It's very interesting. You have a kind of stream of comments saying Today programme, BBC, Tory lapdogs, voice piece of the government. And then you have another stream saying BBC lefty renegades hate the government. It's like people hear the same programme and yet have two completely opposed reactions. So what they have in common, they both hate the BBC. And what they hate is that the BBC is not saying things they agree with. But what they're not hearing is the BBC says lots of things, and some of them you will find sympathetic and some you won't, because it has to be broad and it has to entertain and solicit a range of views. What's happened, I think it's the problem is with us and our tolerance of different opinion and our capacity to live in a world in which people don't agree with us about fundamental things. And the BBC used to confidently hold a place, mark out territory where you could do that, where you could stand alongside people and know that you had interests that transcended your ideological commitments. And that was fine. I just find that space is so eroded now. And it feels to me that, if you exacerbated by social media, all sorts of things, I think it's more on social media. I think we're sort of, feels like a civil war to me, of cultural civil war at the moment.
Really? Bad as that?
Yeah, and not just here, but I think if you look at what's happening in the United States, if you just take a step back, I just looked at, somebody sent me a photograph of the President of the United States at Endeavour, the desk given to the White House by Queen Victoria, in the Oval Office, and in front of him there are a range of branded products, and he's going like that, and you think, whatever you make of Trump, it's not George Washington. And a part of me is really grieved by that, because I believe in high calling. I believe in the BBC as a place that will educate and inform and stimulate, and that nation shall speak peace unto nation. I believe in the Church of England as a means for the salvation of people. I believe in our democracy and our institutions, that they represent a commitment to high standards and to principles that are important and ensure our dignity and our humanity. And I just find that so feeble and weak and under threat at the moment. And I think it's really parlous. It really worries me. I'm sure it worries you, Mike, doesn't it?
It does. I want to ask you, you are so incredibly high profile. You get invited to do everything. And I assume you enjoy it. You look like you enjoy most of them. You've been on pretty well every program, from cooking to dancing to mastermind, to you win things. So you're very high profile. And you were saying before that at the end of a program, your Saturday program, you get people writing in. How do you, and there are some lunatics out there in terms of what they are prepared to write. How do you cope with the sort of things which are no doubt written about you? And I was just thinking about terrible time when you lost David. Some of the awful things which I read that were written.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
how do you cope with that?
Well, it doesn't penetrate, actually. When David died, that was what I had to deal with, which was the loss of the love of my life. And so, a horrible letter or a sort of mean and nasty email, they're like paper darts, Mike. They just, they make no impression. There was a time when I was starting out, when if I got a really horrible, there's a guy who writes to me quite regularly who is, I think it'd be fair to say, not my greatest fan. They're always anonymous. Not always, actually. Some people do leave a name and address, and I write back if they do. I could be bothered. You know, it's what, you know, I don't think if you decide to step into the arena, occasionally combat happens, or, you know, teeth are bared or blood is spilled, and I think that's just something you have to accept, that we bump into each other in life of necessity. It's the nature of being human, isn't it? We compete for insufficient resources in one way or another, and that makes us antagonistic in lots of ways. So you just have to find a way of dealing with it, I think. It certainly doesn't keep me up at night. Occasionally, I got dropped by an old friend last year, which I didn't see coming at all, no explanation given. And I found that quite devastating, actually, because it hadn't happened before. And I just have no idea why. So that kind of critique is the one that I would take with trouble over. But, you know, anonymous nasty letters, I've become rather a connoisseur of them, in fact. I keep the choicer ones.
Might you publish at some time?
Not really publishable, some of them, especially the more graphic ones. But I don't know. And of course, at the end of it is often you realise that there is someone who is in pain of some kind, someone who is full of disappointment or frustration or bitterness, someone who, you know, the sound of your voice reminds them of something, a situation in which they felt that they weren't respected or observed or paid attention to, and it makes them angry and furious, and they write out of that. And
you do a vast number of things. You appear all over the place. You're Chancellor of a university. You've written autobiography. You're writing a novel. I'm sure it just goes on and on. And I'm sure I only know a small part of it. Do you have that? Numbers of people who are as productive as you are have a self-image of actually being quite lazy.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think I've done nothing, and that I am eternally stopping my ears to the siren song of idleness. So I don't know where, I'm sure that's the reason, you know, I think lots of people who are very driven to achieve feel that, because I don't know, it's different now. I don't feel anything like I used to. Notable success early on is in some way an inoculation against that, I think, an ambition and the rest of it, restlessness. And I do now, as I approach 60, I'm going to do things differently, and I'm going to do less. I'm going to do fewer things better, I think.
Does the loss of David, has that made a difference to the way in which you think about the future?
Yeah. I mean, it took the future away, of course. So I hadn't really realised how, when David died, I didn't just lose him, but I lost our life together. So I've had to, all of a sudden, there's a blank where your future used to be. So I spent the last 6 months just trying to find a way of imagining what the future might be. And one of the things that informs that is how short and fragile life is. And I don't want to get to the end of mine and feel that I haven't been fully aware of that, I think.
And can you imagine living quietly? Because you must.
I have been, Mike. I've spent the last 3 months living quietly, and I found it a much more enjoyable experience than I thought. I mean, one thing I've done, which is a new thing for me, and I think it is to do with bereavement, is there's that lovely spring in April and May, I sat in the garden on a beanbag with the dogs, didn't read, didn't listen to music. I just watched the birds flying and looked at the flowers and the bees buzzing and the dogs doing their dog thing for hours. And that was great. I could do that very happily.
And do you think do you see the life as a parish priest continuing, or at some time do you think that you might retire from that?
Yeah, I'm going to retire. I mean, I'm beginning to think about it now, because I would quite like to have, if I could have 10 to 20 years of happy and fulfilled retirement, that would be really nice.
Do you think you might go the way of Merton?
No. I'm a great admirer. I'm presuming you mean Thomas Merton rather than Merton College, Oxford.
I mean Thomas Merton.
He had a terrible death though, Mike. I don't want to go that way.
Sure.
But no, I'm not. I mean, he was a Cistercian and a Trappist and a mystic, and I'm a great admirer. And also connection to Rutland, of course.
Yeah.
And that's not me. I'm a parish, I mean, he's a monk. I'm not a monk. I thought I might be once. I'm a parish priest, and I like to stand in a community trying to make sense of God to the community and the community to God, facing both directions at once. That's what the parish priest does. And I really like doing that. And I think one thing I'm able to do and might do more of is, because of the nature of what I do, I'm able to connect to more people than most. And so I'd probably like to do a bit more of that, I think.
Richard, it's been a real delight.
Lovely talking to you, Mike. I'm sorry I've gone on.
No. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much for that.
Pleasure. See you soon, I hope.
I hope so. Cheers.
See you well. Bye.
Bye-bye.